So here we have a circle of competence. A circle of competence is where you feel right at home because you have already established all the processing necessary to be functional at whatever it is you're doing. In fact, you could essentially become the equivalent of a superintelligence maximizing its utility function, and you love this. So people become, they establish routines and essentially are able to automate them and become just enter a state of flow because it's just so easy. They're so competent. They're so good at what they're doing. That's when you exist within a circle of competence. Everyone has a circle of competence. You could, we could, in fact, we could say that the entire process of being a mind that exists at all is already, is always within a circle of competence in some way. However, it's still useful to think in terms of there not being in terms of not always being inside of circle of competence, but as there existing something which is the unknown to which you could dive into, because that in itself expands our circle of competence. So there's this vast amount of different cognitive modules that you could download. So essentially a different operating system. Everything you do is predicated upon having downloaded a whole bunch of different mimetic tools, right? You have a whole bunch of ways of operating and getting these things to come together. For instance, algebra, right? The idea that two things could be equal, even though they are very clearly different things happening in different regions of your visual field, you can abstractly create the notion these are equal once you understand what equivalence means, and then you can manipulate algebraic formulas. Some people never manage to get that initial step, believe it or not. So some of it is just genetic. Some people don't have the capacity to expand their circle of competence beyond a certain point. That is far easier for others. But in general, we could all try to expand our circle of competence more, and it's not just a matter of taste. It's not. So there's also the confusion that perhaps it's a matter of taste. Like, well, I like country music, and I like hip-hop music, and I like every single music. I have high openness to experience. I'm genuinely someone who attempts to expand my circle of competence. But that in itself is actually just a very... That's the equivalent of perhaps someone who says they're open to randomness and goes to Wikipedia and clicks random article and then reads every article in a linear fashion, right? And not skipping a single word, right? So you try to systematize that which is random, and you give it a very, very narrow structure, which you're already competent at. You're already competent at reading. Reading is just one of the many possible things that a mind could do, right? It could this idea of reading was invented, and we just happen to be capable of actually reading, of actually designing our minds so as to engage in that activity. But there are so many activities that you could design. In other words, there are different there are just different modalities of this. And so someone like Nick Bostrom was the one who pretty much, perhaps not introduced the idea, but very coherently argued for the idea that we as humans should in general expand into the transhuman or the post-human even landscape. So I'm actually going to say post-human here. The post-human scape of possible experiences is really going to be those things that you can't even imagine that you can't imagine. Or it's the sorts of things that are, for instance, brand new aesthetic domains besides the ones that we are currently capable of fathoming, such as music and art and literature and so on. The sorts of different views, sort of ontological views of reality that you could try on philosophically and then experience what it feels like to feel them, right? And then that could become like wine tasting, right? The different varieties of angst induced by different modes of thinking. If you know, try out Schopenhauer and download him. Try out David Pierce and download him. Try out whoever, right, and download them. And you could do this, right? Like you could spend your life, but at the end of the day, it's just it's actually a tiny, tiny little space of all possible ways in which minds can be configured. So the post-human scape is that which we will attain once we murder our present human form, because it is a process of murder. Whenever you go out and genuinely expand your circle of competence, the integration of that into survival only ever happens in the combination of both parts of whatever was useful for survival. So let me explain that. So like you have your past light cone and then you have your future light cone, but the thing is, you're not this focal point. Like you could take the limit to infinity in how microscopic you want to make this focal point, and there's still not a single focal point where you exist. So whatever mimetic sorts of components or information processing things occur in space-time, they're already there. They're already there in that past light cone. They already happen, and some in the future light cone. And so some of these become integrated into that experience that is computationally useful, that is useful for existence, for self-survival, that has that is adaptable, that has the fitness necessary to exist at that location in computational space. So yeah, there are pieces from the past light cone, pieces from the future light cone going into whatever is useful, and perhaps that's not useful, and perhaps it takes this one and this one and then this one. And somehow all of those pieces are exactly what lead to your circle of competence in the now. But you're always ultimately in the circle of competence, is what I'm saying. You can't be in a state of like non-existence, because these are always just what lead to their intrinsic existence. However, it's useful to imagine that that we love to die, and that we love to go out and expand our circle of competence, because that actually somehow seems to be the entire purpose of this thing, the entire telos, the entire structure of this thing. It seems like it's really instigating us to go and become something different.